speak about my own case last and first do a little bit of an overview. But before I do that, I want to tell you how I learned enough to give an overview, and that's because I was in prison for 12 years, and when I was in prison, I got my paralegal certification. So I ended up reading a lot of the briefs from a lot of the women, because they would look at these papers and it was, might as well be reading Russian. And it's like, surfer, what does this mean? And it wasn't until I went through that training where I could decipher it, because it's just so complicated and you don't know what the implications are. So through that process, I saw what happened not in just my county, but in virtually every county in the state of Oregon, because all the women in the state were at Coffee Creek. And so I have a pretty good overview of what happened. And I was shocked to see how domestic violence played a role either directly or indirectly in a lot of the women's cases that were in Coffee Creek. And there was, the panel says defense of battered women, and I would like to say just the appalling lack of defense for battered women in this state. So that's where I start. And from a direct point of view, self-defense in the state of Oregon is not really recognized for battered women, because it is still viewed through the lens of two equal men. And this is particularly true in rural counties. And with Measure 11, if you pick up a weapon, you're just automatically charged. Men, and I'll get into this more, strangle their partners and often leave no marks, and so it's the women that are getting arrested rather than the men. But, so it's directly involved. If women leave, they get custodial interference charges, kidnapping charges, so they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. So those are the kind of the direct routes. Indirectly, there are a lot of drug cases that are a result of either women being with their partners when these things went down, or women using substances to cope with the abuse. And it's sometimes not quite as apparent. For example, there was one woman that was in there for embezzling, and her abuse was economic. Her husband didn't give her any money whatsoever, and so she had to turn her paychecks over to him. So that was an indirect way that abuse factored into it. And another woman was fleeing domestic violence, was on the streets, stole $50 worth of meat from the supermarket, and when she ran, the security guard tackled her, and she ended up getting 3 years in prison for $50 worth of meat when she was a battered woman fleeing abuse. So it really does factor a lot. So the reality of domestic violence in Oregon, we have the second worst record in the whole United States on sexual and domestic violence, and that comes from the CDC. Women and children die at a rate of 1 per week, pretty much, and 19% of the DV deaths are children that are killed. So 20,000 calls a year go unanswered. There are dangerous myths that prevail, and this is particularly prevalent with the defense attorneys. They have, not all of them have, but most, this sense that she could have just left, and they victim blame their own clients. And I heard that over and over and over again from the women in Coffee Creek. The attorneys were their worst enemies by the things they stipulated to, by the way they treated their clients, by the way they infantilized them. So the defense attorneys are not acting in a trauma-informed way. They're, I think, oftentimes mistaking the trauma that these clients are in for being uncooperative or lying. And so they're mistreating them on that basis. Something that we just learned in our last lecture is that when you're traumatized, you need to talk. That's the most healing thing you can do. Well, what is the very first thing every attorney tells you is keep your effing mouth shut. You know? That's what they say. Battered women need to talk. So there needs to be a trauma-informed liaison or somebody to help, because they can hurt their own cases just by trying to heal. So, in 40% of the police officers and this is not just in Oregon or in Portland, but the chief of police here admitted that they are batterers themselves. So when they're the ones that are taking the police reports and making these reports, which is what then the DA is creating his case on, these are through the lens of a batterer. And so this is being projected onto these victims who oftentimes were trying to protect themselves or were not acting on their own will. They were being under duress or coerced. Strangulation, which I have a whole piece on this, is not attempted murder. It's a misdemeanor in all but a very few cases here in Oregon, but it is the most lethal form of violence that there is. And when you've been strangled, you know that your partner can and will kill you at any second with his bare hands. So this is what my own personal experience is, but also through researchers, Bowker and Leonard, for example, nearly 100% of the women and teens that are imprisoned for killing themselves had called for help, and the police did not help them. 80% of protection orders in Multnomah County are not enforced, and that came from the police themselves. They admitted that. So that means they're not being enforced, so you're left to defend yourself. In role-playing trainings up in Eastern Oregon, which is where my incident occurred, the police arrested the wrong person in the role plays 98% of the time. They arrested the victim rather than the predominant aggressor because they have not been properly trained on predominant aggressor studies. And they performed predominant aggressor assessments in less than 10%. And then in Maryland, where they recently switched to the ODARA method, which is an identification method, it reduced the domestic violence deaths by 37% in just 1 year. So, okay.
Why aren't we doing that?
Oops. So there is this kind of perception that domestic violence victims are all Farrah Fawcett in the burning bed. And if you don't fit that mold, you are scapegoated. It's a witch hunt. Domestic violence victims come in all colors, all shapes, all sizes, all segments of society, and 60% are working individuals. They're not what people think of as helpless. And who are the abusers? They're usually the most charming guy in the room. They're the successful ones, and successful abusers are the most dangerous because they're dialed in and they're connected, and those are the ones that tend to be used to getting their own way, and the police usually give them a bye, and these are the ones that usually end up killing their wives. And when you look at the murder-suicides, they're almost always, but not 100%, white males. Not always white males, but who have a strong sense of entitlement. So when female, and this is a women in prison conference, I'm talking about women mostly, but it's not all women. The number of police officers that are killed annually are the top. The number of women and children that are killed is the bottom. So when you say what is a reasonable fear, women that have been threatened with death and have been strangled, their fear is far more reasonable than police officers that are armed and have usually backup and help. And so this is just a quick chart to kind of put it in perspective. So the top three charts are the Iraq War, the 9/11 attacks, and the Afghanistan War. So those are the deaths. And in that very same amount of time, more women and children were killed in America than in all of those terrorist attacks combined. So once again, where is the real threat? It's in our homes. Why doesn't she just leave? So that is the common and deadly assumption because people victim blame based on that. Leaving is when at least 70% of fatalities occur, either leaving or after you've already left. So it doesn't happen, usually until after you've left. So leaving does not solve anything. Mothers stay to protect children because the courts are actually a tool that batterers use. And protective mothers are usually harmed by the courts because if they say, I want complete supervised visitation because this guy will kill him, they're seen as just crazy and histrionic, and they tend to give custody then to the batterers. So that's one reason why they stay. Economic hardship and homelessness. 50% of homeless women and children are fleeing domestic violence. So a lot of times you take into consideration what's worse, because the homelessness can bring a whole set of other problems. And there's a huge victim blaming that goes on. Domestic violence victims are scapegoated. People tend to feel they brought it on themselves. There's also the loss of community and support and everything that you know, all of those connections that we heard about in our last lecture, you lose. And then also, at one point you love this person and you hope that they won't do this. And that may be unrealistic, but it's human nature. So this is just quickly the lethality predictors. And so when women are charged with crimes and these factors aren't taken into account, it's a really unrealistic expectation. Because under the Geneva Convention, we cannot treat enemy combatants that we've captured the way that battered women and children are treated. And yet, society just expects them to take it. And if they fight back, you're punished. So strangulation, I said I was going to speak to this a lot because that has been a factor in almost all of the battered women that I met at Coffee Creek, where they would get strangled if they picked up a knife, a bat, a gun, anything. They got either a measure 11, or one woman only got 3 years for picking up a knife, but the man who strangled her didn't get a day. So it's a misdemeanor unless they just passed it in the last session unless you're pregnant, or in front of your children. But for example, so if your child doesn't have to be present, you don't count. Or this just kind of goes into when it's a misdemeanor, and when they can get away with not even going to jail. And it is the most serious future predictor of violence. And most of the serial killers, most of the serious crimes, Ward Weaver, for example, his wife had told police that he strangled her, and had he gone down on a strangulation charge, then Ashley and Miranda would have still been alive. So it's a very, very serious issue. Oops, okay. So every week in the United States, there are 11 murder-suicides. Once someone is threatened to kill you, you live in that state of imminent fear all the time. And so that is, I'm getting to what constitutes duress and coercion, because once you realize that they can kill you, it doesn't take many times of them strangling you for you to be under their complete control. So I'm using this example of putting things into context, because this concept is really important. Now, if I were to strip right now and show you all my genitalia, that would be considered lewd behavior. However, I did that many, many, many times because when I was in prison, my captors forced me to do that in order to see my children. I would have crawled through 100 miles of broken glass to hold my children. So, was I under duress when I committed this lewd act? Yes, I would say that's duress. And so, that's what's taken out of the equation when you just look at the behavior. If you just look at someone who does something and you don't look at the context of duress, then you're punishing them for something that any one of you would do in that same situation. And that's a very unfair standard. So it's the same thing for victims of domestic violence. You live in genuine fear. if you leave, you're in more jeopardy of being killed. If you stay, you can risk losing your children, because if your partner commits a crime, you can be charged with it, or you can be charged with failure to protect. So you just don't know what to do, because if you leave, then you can't protect your children, because unless you get supervised visitation, you'll be with them alone. So a lot of people are in these Sophie's Choice situations and aren't getting helped by the system, but the system is very quick to punish them. And some examples of the people that are in there, in Coffee Creek, a very religious woman, the man is the law of the house, and when he beat the children, he would make her stand with her nose against the wall. And the children told the courts when the father was arrested, that their mother was a victim of abuse too, but she got 20 years. Another one in a similar situation got 7 years. One person asked for a restraining order, and it was denied, and when her abuser killed her son, she got 16 years for failure to protect. Another girl was raped by her stepfather for many, many years, and when she finally was 17 and got a boyfriend of her own, she and the boyfriend beat up the stepfather, and they both got 70 months. The stepfather who raped her has never done a day in jail. Another woman, her ex put her in the hospital, and when she got home from the hospital, he came back to her house, and she got a gun, and they struggled over it, and it went off, and he got shot in the shoulder, and she's right now still there doing 5 years, and he never did a day in jail for attacking her and putting her in the hospital. And another friend, Carlin, she was trafficked and was offered an 18-month deal if she would testify against this man who had threatened to kill her family and children, and she didn't testify against him, so she has 2 double life sentences with no option of parole. Another woman had broken up with her boyfriend and went back to her husband. The boyfriend killed the husband, and the police had him on tape saying that, oh no, Patty knew nothing about this. But once he knew he was going to jail, then he told the police it was her idea. And they were tried together, and the jury instruction, after he had already confessed, was if you find one of them guilty, you find both of them guilty. So she had no chance. And this is a lot, but basically what I wanted, this is for me because I was rushing, but when the Minnesota courts looked at women who are in prison, they realized that 50% had committed a crime to please a partner, 45% committed a crime to get drugs for a partner, 40% admitted to a crime, they copped for the crime that the partner had committed. Some lied to authorities to hide the crime, and 21% chose jail rather than going back home to a partner. And that actually, there's a really kind of severe case in Oregon where one woman had claimed that she committed a murder to go to jail that she never even committed. She did it to escape the abuser, and they finally found out that it wasn't even her. She didn't have anything to do with it, but she was safer in jail. So in Oregon, you can either commit self-defense and then you go to prison, or you can not and you can die. So those are usually your options in the rural counties. Oops. And just wanted to point this out, that instead of sending these women to prison and spending all this money, it would be a lot better to treat them for post-traumatic stress. Okay. So now we'll get to my story. Who am I? I used to be a surf photographer. I did a lot of sports modeling, but I wrote some things, filmed a couple movies. But my most important job was as a mother. And I was very, very devoted to my children. And then I married a man who I thought was amazing until he started beating me and threatening to kill my children. And I was smart and independent, and I never in a million years thought that I would be a victim of domestic violence. I'm not who that happens to. But it was. And I tried everything possible I could think of. I left, and he stalked me to my friends. I'm from Hawaii, but I went to very remote connection in California, thinking he won't think of that, and it only took him 3 days to find me and threaten to burn their house down. I went to the police. The police in Oregon and the authorities committed so many crimes in my case. They destroyed evidence. They shredded documents that were subpoenaed. The DA in my case lied about convening a grand jury. He didn't even convene one, but said he did. I didn't have a preliminary hearing, none of this. I was broke. I had like 17 injuries, and I was black and blue when I went to jail because I killed my husband. And, oops, sorry. That was just one of the pictures from the night. And then, oops. So the other picture was taken about 3 years before it happened. It was an ongoing thing. He had threatened to chop my children into pieces so they would never find their bodies. He'd thrown me out of a moving car. My children had told people. We had gone to the authorities. And the one time he strangled me until I blacked out, which had happened on more than one occasion, but I called the police. The police came and they laughed with him and told him, "Oh, you just need to get some counseling. You know, we've all been through this." And he had just almost killed me in front of my children. My children were crying. And then that told me I was never getting any help. And so, you know, a lot of things happened, and I tried a lot of things, but what was kind of a crucial moment for me was my stepfather refused to shake his hand. And so my husband realized that the jig was up, people were starting to know, and he had kind of a breakdown, and he threw my youngest son, the little blonde one, in the back of the car, and I jumped in, and he started driving really fast, and he was sobbing, and he's saying, "Everybody knows now, there's no coming back," and he just tried to drive us all off a cliff. And I struggled with him for the steering wheel, and realized at that time, if he killed my child and I didn't do anything to stop it, that would be my fault. And what could I live with more? If I didn't save my son, or if I killed my husband? And I said, well, the next time he does something like this, I'm gonna really have to do this. And I didn't want to, but I made the choice to do it. And given the same set of circumstances, it was the only choice. I would still choose to save my child rather than let my child be killed. Even though I went through 12 years of prison, even though I was publicly painted as this, you know, psycho bitch, sociopathic killer. And I'm not, by the way, the prison made me do a psych eval, and they were shocked when they found out I'm the furthest thing from a sociopath that there is, you know. Surprise. But, you know, and part of that was my own defense attorney. Well, I went through a couple of them. The first one was also arrested himself for domestic violence. The other one was drunk at most of the meetings, would bop me on the head with papers, and told everybody I was lying because I challenged him on his money and found out he had embezzled or misappropriated about $25,000, and I sent that to the bar. The bar said it was valid, but I would have to litigate it in court. Well, I didn't have any money because he had it. And so then what he did, because in the state of Oregon, what people don't realize is you can't sue for malpractice unless you're exonerated. So he deliberately sabotaged any chance that I would ever have a post-conviction relief ability. And then he's publicly gone in the papers and said, oh yeah, she did this, she did this, she did this. Things that I can prove aren't true. But who are you going to believe? Some psycho who's been in prison or a defense attorney. So that's kind of my story. Since I've been out, I've been working really hard so that this doesn't happen to other people. And I've written 3 briefs of the court, one for the United Nations for one of my clients, trying to keep her out of prison for kidnapping her own children. I just got back from California where I was in the state of appeals court. They accepted my arguments there. And to take domestic violence into consideration, because right now they really don't in many cases. So these are I'll finish up here in a second. How attorneys harm their DV victims. They operate on those myths. They don't conduct trauma-informed surveys. I almost think that defense attorneys and public defenders need, like right now the police in metropolitan areas have DV advocates that go in and help. They need these for defense attorneys, because when, especially a battered woman that's an authority figure, you're so afraid, and if somebody doesn't understand, things can go terribly wrong. You need an advocate there with your defense attorney. They stipulate to facts that aren't facts based on a trauma victim's experience. And there just aren't, like if you asked right now, who's the DV attorney in Oregon, and until maybe Dennis is, but if you asked anybody right now, there's no name that pops up, like who's the battered woman expert that you would get to defend in a case like that. Nobody can give you a name because there isn't really one of those that I know of. Oops. So one of the things we're working on really quickly is we're trying to start a hotline for abusers to call, because not everybody wants to be that. But what we've learned is hurt people, and trauma people get triggered, and right now it's like a suicide prevention hotline. There isn't anything. So we're working on that because we think that can help prevent violence. And then I wrote, and Louise helped me. We got 2 laws passed this last year in the Oregon legislature. Thank you. Yeah, everybody said you've got less than a 1% chance, and I'm glad I didn't even pay attention, because, and one of them was that all students, grades 7 through 12, must now be educated about domestic violence and the implications and the understanding. So we won't have any more DAs like mine who said, oh, he choked her a little bit. That's not abuse. So that's the end for me.